Okay, I think we're live. Welcome to another Saphyre Live webinar. So I appreciate everyone joining. The topic today is AI innovation for legal agreements and negotiations. Joining me today is Michael Brandi, our CIO at Saphyre. And I know, Brandi, this is a topic near and dear to our hearts because we love to geek out on the AI, both you and I and some of the members of the team.
I thought you meant legal agreements was a topic near and dear to my heart.
Definitely the AI tech is our thing, so we're going to hit on that piece. I think what we're going to start in terms of the conversation is first the state of the world today, the problem areas, and then we're going to deep dive on the technology, the how. But before we go ahead, I want to make the audience aware about this is a live session and we're going to collect questions in real time. So hopefully you've already registered and you're logged into the Zoom link. And within the Zoom function, you'll see a Q&A function on your screen. So at any point in time, feel free to submit your questions. If you'd like to ask your question live, please write that in the question you're typing, and our folks here doing the whole setup will unmute you to allow you to ask your question when we get to the Q&A portion. So one more time, look for the Q&A function. You can submit your questions there, and then when we get to the Q&A, we'll speak to those questions out loud and answer them. And again, if you want to ask your question live, just put that in your question and our team will unmute you. Okay, so let's talk about the state of the world, like I said before, the challenges. And so we're talking about legal agreements today, but when we get to the solution, it's not just legal agreements, but it's almost documentation, data anywhere, how AI can be applied. So the use case is repeatable. Actually, the solution is repeatable into multiple use cases.
Yeah, the technologies that we're going to talk about, while we're going to focus on the legal solution today and where this applies in the legal workflows and contracts, amendments, et cetera, also applies across the board. Any sort of document you receive anywhere in the process, whether it's a tax document like a W-8, or someone gives you some PDF of SSIs. This same technology applies. There are different challenges in those different areas, but the solution is relatively similar across all of them.
Correct. So let's talk about what the lawyers on the buy side, sell side, asset servicer side go through today in the finance industry to get this documentation up and running. And again, I know you're a tech expert, but you're very familiar with how these operations work. What do those folks encounter today? Yeah.
Every relationship between different firms starts with an agreement. And those agreements can go from a simple agreement, something like an IMA, to a much more complex agreement like an ISDA. And these agreements can be between two parties or multiple parties, right? And so you have different parties involved in this agreement. Within those agreements, you have different terms that need to be captured. You have different levels of agreements. So you could have, for instance, an umbrella agreement that covers all funds between two parties. Or you could have fund-specific agreements that have terms that apply just for specific funds. And so these are very challenging data points, and mapping all this data between all the parties involved in these different transactions is quite complex.
So let's break this out a little bit, because we said a lot there. And I'd also argue that the IMAs, the investment management agreements, can be complex themselves. So the intent here for the audience listening in is we can get into how this AI innovation can extrapolate the information. But it isn't just extrapolation. The whole idea here is to be smarter when you collect that information, how you use it. How do you automate your compliance? How do you, let's say, pre-fill information for clients with context? So we're going to touch on those points as well. You mentioned IMAs, for example. So we know that in a case where, let's say, an asset manager is managing a separately managed account, they got an IMA in place, there'll be restrictions on specific markets, like, hey, we don't want to have our money invested in Brazil or India.
Different counterparties.
Correct. So for some reason, broker B and C, we don't want you to trade with on these accounts and whatnot. So there's restrictions in those cases, or restricted currencies like the Russian ruble or whatnot, right? Not that we need to say that, but these are the types of stipulations that are captured. And yes, you can actually use AI innovation to extrapolate that information, but then how do you remember it and use it for pre and post trade activities is the other aspect around this.
So I think you mentioned something there, extrapolate. And before we get to how you extrapolate and use it, we have to kind of talk about one of the challenges that are presented up front. So Lawyers, we love them, are masters of the English language or whatever language they're working in. What does this mean? It's often in art the way certain things are phrased in legal agreements. And when you move between firms, the same terms may be phrased extremely differently by two different attorneys. And so the whole concept of just taking this data out of the agreement gets very complex as you get into the nuances of the English language that are presented by an attorney.
And even when agreements are standard, the legal language that in the paragraph that's written by the lawyers are so nuanced that an AI you can say is very smart. But I'm going to give the one example. When I started Saphyre 8 years ago, I used to hear the word fund from sell sides, from multiple buy sides and asset servicers, and they use the word fund, but in some cases it's around a beneficial owner legal entity. In other cases it's around a special purpose vehicle. In other cases it's a portfolio that's not a legal entity, but it's a trading portfolio. And unless you have that context built in for a normalized data model for the AI to be able to translate that, you're just capturing information potentially incorrectly.
Oh yeah, my favorite example, fund is much more complex. It's a much more difficult example, but I like it simple, right? You can talk about a termination event. Is it 90 days? Is it 3 months? Is it 1 quarter? Agreements use all three of those terms. And if you aren't able to understand that those three things fundamentally mean the same thing, and you're just grabbing that data, you're capturing data that isn't going to be relevant and useful downstream in further processes.
There's also nomenclature is another thing. So one of the things that we did in our work, right, through the Saphyre endeavor, is understanding creating an optimal user experience. And we know there's a lot of big firms, institutions that have a ton of data. I used to work at some of them, and we look at that data, and in some cases the data is bad, but maybe we know how to clean it up. But on top of that, we don't necessarily know how that data is used by our clients and how that data is actually translated with the parties they actually do other business with, right? And I'll just give you an example. If I'm a sell-side firm and you trade with me, you're still trading with multiple other sell-side firms where that same data could be interpreted slightly differently. On top of that, there's the asset servicers underneath it, what's going on with the fund accountant behind it, the outsourced middle office, those activities.
And you're not even talking about different firms, right? You're talking about different lines of business.
Yeah,
even within
correct.
the same firm, they may look at something like, I don't know, fund is a good example, but they may reference it different ways across these different areas of the business. Okay, so for instance, in custody versus capital markets, you may look at ERISA differently. There may be additional stipulations for an eligible retirement account. So with these different things, what Saphyre has done, or the way we looked at this, was we created a data model. And this is a universal data model that we use across everything on our platform. So
we'll get to that in the solution part.
Yeah,
So,
sure.
But just let's use some of those examples. When I said taxonomy, I use this example. I've seen FX space swaps, FX underscore swaps, FX concatenated swaps. And it's not three different trading instruments. It's the same trading instrument, just spelled three ways differently. And even in the user experience example, and we've had this where clients would type in the word CDX, and you would assume that's all credit trading instruments, all 13. But some firms, it only means 7 or 6
5
of them.
or
It's not all 13. So unless you do the homework of actually understanding the firms and how they actually capture that information, you'll miss that nuance. You'll make the assumption it's all 13 trading instruments in credit and not just 6 or 7. And the idea is if you create this normalized data model, which we're going to hit on, that is the lens that gets applied onto AI later. But just one more nuance in terms of the state of the world, because you also mentioned umbrella agreements. And I don't want that to be lost on the audience here. It's actually really important. The reason why umbrellafication is occurring with a lot of buy-side firms is because they have a list of standard terms that they will apply to their funds for that umbrella agreement.
Correct.
And in the old days, you would have a bilateral contract, whether it's ISDAs, GIMRAs, whatever, MSFTAs. You would have a bilateral for every single fund, and you would repeat those terms multiple times. So the idea here is actually creating a structure, a normalized data structure, where you can understand umbrellified terms, which even though they can be standard, we know from our experience, several firms will have bespoke terms for umbrella versus per fund.
Correct.
And knowing the nuance between the two. I'm sorry.
And then the fund terms also can supersede those umbrella terms, right? So you may have a specific termination event that applies generally across the relationship, but then for this specific fund, you may have a different termination event that applies for that use case. So it's not just, when you look at the terms, you have the umbrella terms that govern the relationship overall, and while most of them are standard, each relationship between two firms are going to have their own specific terms, but you also have amendments with specific fund level terms and the interaction, and some supersede, some are in line, and some just follow the umbrella.
Yeah. So now let's talk about, I know we have sell sides and custodians watching this webinar, but we have also buy sides, and so let's talk about the attraction, the pain that the buy side has to go through. U.S. Treasury clearing, it's a new repapering event, but they got the buy side firms have to do that across multiple sell-side counterparties. And so the idea here also is there, and we'll hit on this, intelligence to be able to repeat that activity across all their sell sides for all their funds, and then tracking it. Yeah. That's another aspect. The other thing is, I talked about user experience, and we talked about nomenclature, but lawyers are notorious for not wanting to work within a kludgy UI user interface to type in information. They want to still work in their word processing experience, right? So Microsoft Word, or in the old days Word Perfect, if you remember that. But they want to be able to use a word processing tool to manage the language, the redlining, and all that. And so allowing that experience to continue, but then being able to digitize that information and capture it is also important. So that user experience, I would say, is key. Whether they're using email or a platform, so long as they have the word processing experience, that makes this more adaptable as well as adoptable, because the different agreement types are not all standard. IMAs in particular, again, are very, very bespoke. Was there more that you wanted to add?
I think we've kind of also glossed over what I call the elephant in the room, right? You have two firms that may have been working together for 30 years. We're talking about umbrella terms, right? Those umbrella terms very likely were established 30 years ago. Yeah. Those agreements were scanned on some scanner on a photocopier a year, 2 years, maybe 5 years after that. These documents are not digitally native. They are not easy to use. They are, sideways, diagonal, lines through them, bad copies, and they're stored someplace that nobody ever looks at. So on top of all these language nuances, you have the challenge of actually reading the physical document, because it was negotiated so long ago, and the quality of that digital image is just not great.
Yeah, and we're gonna hit on that too. So I think we got a visual, because we talked about a lot of the problems, and let's try and consolidate this to a few examples for the folks watching the webinar. And the idea here is, what are the types of things that you actually encounter? What are the things that you want to actually capture out of these legal agreements? So these are just some examples. This is not an exhaustive list. It's to make it relatable. I know we mentioned before broker and market and currency restrictions, so we have that listed up there. You talked about trade termination events. There's the notorious eligible collateral detail
CSA
schedules
between multiple parties.
Those are tables that we know we've seen Xerox copies of. Minimal transfer amounts. There's also standing instructions, sometimes contained within the legal agreements, but also outside of that, there's I'm going to hit on this, SSIs. That's a tangential topic, but they do get communicated via.
They get sent via PDF.
Correct. So how can you apply this type of technology, these solutions, to all these use cases? And again, the idea is that you're agreement type agnostic, because if it only works for one agreement type, then you're not creating a repeatable model. Right. You've only created a one-trick pony. What you want to do is actually develop technology that can actually do this across types and find the commonalities, and then tweak it along the way. So let's, I think we can step away from that in terms of the slides. So let's talk about now the solution, or at least our journey. So, I know there's, just put it out there. Certainly, we don't hold the keys to all the answers. We think we've gone through a lot of pain, 8 years through this. I think we're well versed on this. So there may be folks or firms who have another take on the approach. But we're going to share our journey in terms of like how we apply the solution to these challenges. Why don't you step us through in terms of like how we can build a solution, an innovative approach, leveraging AI, because it's not just AI. That's the other thing. I know some of the firms think, hey, I got a bunch of data. I'm just going to throw AI on this, and magic's going to happen.
Cross my fingers and hope it figures it out. So as much as I'd like to sit here and talk about AI, the latest models, whether it's Grok 3 or the next OpenAI one or the next one from Claude, there's real world problems here. And Gabino, you touched on our journey. And that journey is important because when we started this endeavor, we were focused primarily on the relationship between the buy side and the broker. We then expanded to the custodian. We expanded to the middle office, the fund accountant, the tax accountant. And as you go through this journey, you realize that the data across these parties is either similar or the same. And as we said before, discussed and categorized in very different ways. But ultimately, you're coming down to the same key data points about the fund, about the trading instruments, about the terms of the agreement, about the legal entities.
And if I can interject, and this is important for, I think, the folks on the webinar to see. Sorry, I'm just trying to make sure we have things clear there. But you have to have your own normalized data model. I need to put this out there, and I think we touched on it before, but let me call it out. Everyone knows fixed latest protocols. Everyone has heard of ISO 2022. The ISDA organization has their common domain
data,
model. That they're advancing. These are all good things. The truth is that there are massive organizations with legacy technology that is not going to be able to adopt a standard or the latest standard to meet all these needs. And so when we say that there needs to be a data normalization, the AI has to account for an opinion on how this data needs to be normalized, regardless of how your client may see it, or let's say the asset servicer sees it outside of the buy side and sell side. You have to be able to let everyone have their own lens, but then a normalized model so that the AI has one version of the truth to be able to apply the rules.
And so there's a nuance there that you glossed over. I just want to highlight. Each one of those data models in the industry is very focused on a specific area,
standards,
right? There's standards. So, whatever those standards are, whether it's through ISDA or someone else, they're focused on one area of the business. And what we learned through our journey over the years is you need to take a broader approach and look across the different types of workflows and across the different areas within organizations to create a true data model. And by no means do we have it perfect, and this is evolving all the time. But the base level for all these discussions is that data model, whatever it may be, right? And then you realize you work with these different counterparties, and they already have a data model, and it's slightly different than yours. So there's a mapping portion. And what we've done within Saphyre, and this is tied into the AI and everything else that we do on the platform, is we have translation. So we take firm A's data model and we translate it to Sapphire's. But before firm A's data goes to firm B, it is translated in real time out to firm B's data model.
And what we're doing here, I'm going to speak in plain terms here for the folks. The knee-jerk reaction to the industry is to adopt a standard
and force everyone to do it.
And force it. You're not going to get everyone to you're not going to be able to force everyone to adopt a single standard. If you have different departments working on different standards, one department in derivatives are using ISDA common domain, your traders are using FIX, and there's different approaches to how to normalize that data, you're not going to get there. So therefore, you have to do that homework step in creating that normalized data model. And I think one of the advantages that we've encountered is when you go through onboarding and maintenance, from the point of inception, you actually understand how that data is supposed to be mapped for every single firm. Not from one firm's perspective, but again, from multiple buy sides have different models for their data versus multiple sell sides versus multiple asset servicers. And that's the kind of thing that you have to build so that the AI innovation can be scalable where you use that lens. And when you were talking about that mapping, at least in our journey, we actually map this data as part of the onboarding experience because then we actually understand the trading relationships, the accounts on how they're mapped, and that's then how the AI can become much smarter. It becomes much more scalable. It may seem daunting, but to your point, if you're building off of the ISDA common domain model and you're just solving derivatives.
It's the foundation for everything we've built, right? Whether it's a simple workflow between two parties, a complex workflow between multiple parties, or a workflow that's AI in a single party. AI and multiple parties. The data model is really the foundation. And so before you do anything with fancy AI, you have to get that right. Otherwise, the AI is just going to give you uninterpretable or completely wrong answers.
And another thing I want folks to know, because you can say you have a lot of data, and if you leave it to the AI to interpret the stuff, the truth is there's memory capacity. Mm-hmm. So when you're running a job, when you're using up, I think they call it tokens
context,
and stuff.
Yeah, it's the context windows, how much you can fit within.
Correct. When it gets to this upper limit in terms of the memory, it will actually make more mistakes.
The performance goes down as you reach the context limit.
Correct. And we know in finance, because there's a way you could do, you can tweak it to be 99% accurate to 90% accurate, and believe me, that difference is huge, but in finance, everyone wants the 100%
accurate, yeah.
and the 100% creates more performance constraints on the AI, and therefore you're going to encounter more issues. You're going to find that it's not worth it. So therefore, and I think we're going to go through the talk through here, you have to create an iterative process for how to be precise about what you're capturing. Yep. And it becomes easier if you create that lens of the normalized data model. The challenge is for firms who are adopting AI solutions, if you're building it only within your four walls, your AI is only going to be as smart as the four walls of your firm and how you understand it.
Only going to understand your data.
Correct.
It's not going to understand when someone sends you an email or a document or something that is in their internal firm's nomenclature, their data model. It won't be able to map it. And in fact, in certain scenarios, like you mentioned at the beginning, with things like fund, you will likely mismap between different firms unless you've done that data model homework and established this in advance.
And the way we discover it is when we bring on a new firm and we do at least one brand new onboarding, we ask all these questions of the firm so that we can actually catch this in the maintenance of things. Because normally where the AI falls over, you're going to have a policeman, a physical person who's cleaning the data regularly for these use cases, unless you've accounted for the bespoke nomenclature data model structures for every single firm. And again, that's the opportunity of when they've been onboarded and maintained first, is you capture that up front and you've now laid the groundwork moving forward. And it's not just for that firm, data model. It's how they use that data model and nomenclature with every sell side, with every asset servicer, right? Custodian, fund accountant, outsourced middle office, tax agent, and then also the electronic platforms, whether it's an order management system or electronic platform, a trading platform. Those all matter in the context. But let's get to the...
We've gone really far in the data model. We haven't even touched on the fun stuff.
But I think the important thing is that's the foundation. Because I know, and there are some firms that are thinking about it the right way. Other firms are like, I'm just going to buy this AI, plop it. It's going to make magic happen. And I'm just going to teach it regularly. And we've gone through that, and we know that the AI needs this context on top of it. So let's step through it. Now, let's take an example of, let's do two things. Let's walk through the folks about how, a regular bilateral agreement is put together versus an umbrella agreement, right? And then let's also consider like the Xerox copies of things, images and whatnot.
So if you think about this process, right, you have some legal agreement that's been scanned a decade ago. That agreement contains the parties, contains the terms, contains everything, all the key data points. So you've got this in a system, it's been scanned, it's digitized to some capacity. You now have to take that scanned image and convert it to text. So that's the first step, right? So you've got to convert everything to text. Then you have to, assuming that the translation is a high degree of accuracy, you need to store that for later use, okay? When you have that stored and formatted appropriately so that it can be ingested by an AI, because there are, what we talked about before, context limits, right? You can send too much data and then the AI may not be able to handle all of that at once, or accuracy goes down as you send that data. You then need to have the established...
So let's pause. Yeah. So there's capturing of the information, whether it's an image or text, creating a text format already that we can actually then trust as a source and come back to. So I think it's an important detail that you don't want to perform all of the extrapolation information, AI activities at point of data capture. I think there's a revisiting of the data source to be able to then extrapolate the information and interpret it, correct?
Exactly. So you've got this, now you have this record, this saved piece of data. What you need to do with this data is now, how do you interpret it? How do you take it to the next level? So you're going to send this through an AI, but as we discussed before, sending it through the AI and just saying, tell me what the terms are, get me this piece of data, get me that piece of data, doesn't necessarily work, right? You have to train the AI with the data model first. Here is the model of the data that you should be looking to populate and understand. And that combined with the AI, now it doesn't matter which AI you're using, most of the modern commercial platforms will be able to do this, can map that data with given the appropriate context, the appropriate information, and a data model to normalize it so that it can be used downstream in whatever system that you're using.
So here's the beauty. If you know the different types of agreements that you're trying to address, and if you capture the information once, like you can even do, and we've actually done this, is pre-fill some of the information too. So as part of the amendment process, you can actually pre-fill like legal entity data, LEI, addresses, other details behind the funds without requiring the lawyers to have to remember all those details.
Oh yeah.
That's a beautiful thing, by the way, when you have a normalized data model.
Once you've structured that data, the use cases are pretty endless. You can auto-populate upcoming agreements, you can templatize the agreements, you can do amendments automatically to these more complex, larger, long-running agreements. That data can be reused across not just legal workflows, but it can be used across your collateral account opening with your custodian when you extract it from the CSA.
Or even better, when you're opening up 160 markets in your custody experience, and you got to fill out the same information multiple times across bespoke documents per market, or even a bank-related document related to those markets. That's a huge time saver. That's where you can be smarter. And again, that requires data normalization with the context of the clients, in this case also in the context of the local markets as well.
You have to have the document context, you have to have the market context, you have to have individual clients' nomenclature, how they structure their data. All that needs to be taken into account to make that magical thing of creating these documents and populating this information happen.
Yeah, so I think we have a visual, because I know we didn't step through it, but like again, to help crystallize this for folks, and we only talked about the first half right now, right? Ingesting this information. This is just a simplified kind of workflow of how we think about AI automation at Saphyre, at least. And we went through, I think, around the first three boxes. But I think the other piece that we're going to get asked about, I'm sure in the questions as they came in.
If it hasn't come in already, if AI is not 100% accurate 100% of the time, how can I trust this? These are financial transactions. We have a compliance department. We get audited. How can we make this reliable? And so for the time being, Saphyre insists on a human in the loop. Okay, and this is the concept many of us have in our jobs and have had before of maker checker, right? If Gabino's entering data.
So before we get to maker checker, just real quick, I think it's important for folks to know. We also go through an authentication method even when we involve humans. So as we're going to get to this maker checker thing, the idea here is you don't want a callback process. And when Mike here talks about maker checker, he's talking about that the AI is the maker. And that specific humans are the checkers, whether 4i, 6i, 8i, 20i checks. But then also, are you authenticating the humans? Because when I used the example earlier about those PDFs for the SSIs, we know that that's manually being captured, and then there's the notorious callback process for SSIs. That's also sensitive with
We're getting AI to answer that phone call very soon.
Well, the idea here is if you have the right authentication methods, and this is something that we've employed as well, we eliminate the entire callback process. We digitally authenticate the individuals involved, so we know it's exactly the individual at their office physically or at their home. And we could talk through that with folks who are interested. But that process creates insurances checks and reduces the risk for incorrect information being aggregated as part of this extrapolation process with the AI.
And of course, all of this is logged for your compliance. Obviously, in a financial transaction, you can't just say we're validating this. All this needs to be logged for audit and later validation, so on and so forth. But
and then one more thing. So as we then are, let's say we get through this extrapolation piece, we go through the maker checker process, the checkers approve this information, then you digitally store this so that this information not only is searchable, right, but we can automate compliance activities. So like, again, we know, at least at Saphyre, back during COVID, several of our buy-side clients were out of compliance with their NAV trade termination events, right? And we created this automated process, right, to not only extrapolate the NAV trade termination events out of their agreements, but then to auto-calculate when that occurs on every single day.
And alert.
Correct, and alert the parties, not just the buy side, but the sell side as well. So it prevents you from, allocating and settling against an account that you can't unless a waiver was actually granted. And so this is the idea, is to be smarter with the information you're collecting, not just to capture it and then make it searchable, but make it actionable on the back of it. I think the other thing too that's interesting is when we talk about umbrella agreements, there's this master. And we know some of the large asset managers have multiple umbrella agreements with the same counterparty. But there's an effective and expiration date for when those terms are affected. And so if you help track this on a go-forward basis, so yeah, they're brand new negotiations that are massive, right, in terms of brand new negotiations of agreements. But then there's those onesie, twosie amendments that are occurring, or even 10Zs at a time, that you're doing. And then if you aggregate those across the umbrella agreements, that actually matters when those onesie, twosies move between multiple umbrella agreements with the same counterparty. And you need to know
Effective
what
and termination are
correct.
critical.
Whether the same termination events are the same or now different based on the effective and expiration dates of when the amendments occurred across those same umbrella agreements. Plus, what is the clearing entity that you're settling against for those trades may change based on the umbrella agreements. This is also incorporated. And again, we can cut this across tri-party agreements, right? We talked about IMAs. This could be master confirmation agreements. It's not just limited to your typical, MSFTA, GMRA is done, and so on. So again, I'm just looking at the time. We're 30 minutes in, and we can totally geek out.
We could go for hours at this point.
Yeah. So go ahead.
Going through the details, but I think what's an important point, and Gabino talked about it briefly, is all data, what we understood, is essentially has an effective and expiration. So throughout the platform, whether you're getting your legal registration for your legal entity, right, that has an effective expiration date. When does that expire? And tracking that so that you know when this information is expired is critical. And so that's not part of the AI, that's just part of that data model and that foundational process that we've implemented across the board.
It's creating a repeatable process because it's not just getting the stuff done up front as part of the static pre-trade data that everyone talks about, it's also making this visible in post-trade. And so for your derivatives trades, knowing whether the amendment was completed on time and when it occurred, what terms are actually applied to that trade. Like
when you need to do maintenance.
When you need to do maintenance.
When
did you hit a NAV
refresh.
termination?
Yeah.
Is this a restricted broker, a restricted market, right? Like, are those applied? Those are things that can be brought forward in real time to the front office, but if you've missed the front office, the trade support teams will be able to visibly see this and the alert will be real in the post-trade processing. So it's creating this repeatable model by making this intelligent interpretation without having to dig through 100 pages in a trading agreement, paragraph, or page 80, paragraph 3, section 2. Now it's there, not only searchable, but you're creating a process to make it repeatable and compliant.
It's standardized, it's easy to read, it's reportable, searchable, and actionable.
Okay, so we're going to go to Q&A, but before we go to Q&A, we have to make a call out, I think, for our next live webinar series. This is on March 5th, so at 12 p.m. Eastern. Please mark your calendars. This is about how we help, how can buy sides can streamline their operations. So this is a wide topic. We're going to talk about all the activities that the buy side undertakes and how they can kind of create this one and done experience across their operations. So be sure again to tune in, was it March 5th at 12 p.m. Eastern, mark your calendars. Now back to the Q&A to remind you, there's a Q&A function on Zoom. So if you haven't asked your questions yet, please be sure to click on the Q&A option and we will answer your questions right now. And FYI, if you want to, oops, sorry, poor Brandi here tore his ACL and his leg is in my way and I kind of stepped on it. So.
Sorry about the odd angles, everyone.
So we're going to read through the questions. But if you want to speak or ask the question live, just make sure you write that in your question and our team will unmute you so you can ask it live. So let's go with the first question here. How does your solution help process these agreements even as they get amended over time?
Yeah, I think that goes back to what we were talking about with the umbrella agreements and the amendments. So we have the ability to have amendments that are ongoing, and you can add your funds and you can add your specific terms, and those are updated in the data model. We talked a little bit about how we track that, where amendments can supersede your terms in the umbrella agreement. You can also have the effective and expiration date of these amendments. So we kind of covered that. I think that came in earlier in the call.
What we're suggesting here is to create a repeatable model going forward. And this is where the AI is mostly useful, is when you're actually doing the incremental changes over time as opposed to a massive update. I think what a lot of firms are looking at is doing an analysis of all their data, teaching the AI all of that all at once, and that's where it kind of falls over. And I think there's other things too that we could talk about in terms of what, there's a nuance here that's very important. Saphyre ensures that the AI forgets the information too, by the way. That's an important detail for folks. You don't want now we leverage AI in our own unique instance. It's not shared,
Correct.
It's not open sourced, but we ensure that when we ask it questions and make the interpretation, after the question is answered.
These are one-time events, so we're not using the data, just to be clear, we're not using the data to train a custom model. So client data that comes into our system is not used broadly to train. We're actually just using API calls to different models that are dedicated to Saphyre's usage, hosted securely in Microsoft Azure, so that we can interpret certain things, but then those calls and that data is thrown away. It's not saved anywhere.
This allows you to be compliant, and this is where you're not using the client's data for any other purpose. The other thing also we should mention is Saphyre has structured an AI agnostic approach. So we can use any AI model that we choose. And the reason why that's important too is you're not beholden to one solution. And also regulations can change, concerns and whatnot. So this allows us to be adaptable at the same time.
The rate of change in the field is astronomical, and the flexibility that this solution gives us is really critical ongoing, because you see things changing every day.
We got one here that says, how do you handle tri-party agreements? But I think it's no different than a bilateral agreement, just as there's a third party here. And again, you normalize the data structure. You say, hey, for let's say your tri-party collateral agreements, you got a buy side, you got a sell side, and you got a custodian, right?
Translates to the data model and then translates out to the different models of each individual party.
It says here, can you explain how you normalize the data across buy sides and sell sides and interpreting legal agreements? So again, I think these were earlier asked, but we did cover this before. In our journey, you can look at your full data set, but the best way, honestly, is, and again, we advocate for this, if you have a solution that sits outside your firm that works with your clients and there are other parties, then you have a source of information for how that data needs to be structured for them as well as for your firm. This is how you normalize the data. I know when I worked at one particular bank, I only understood the data for how that bank used it. Then I worked at a consortium with multiple banks and their clients. And for the first time, and this is going back 8 and 9 years ago or so, 10 years ago, that for the first time I'm like, wow, the world doesn't work like the bank I used to work at. The data is actually nuanced, and there needs to be a way to normalize this. I think one of the analogies we use is the industry doesn't work like smartphones right now. The finance industry still works in this batch process where they're exchanging files at a point in time, and every firm is maintaining their own version of the data. But if we think of smartphones, which are not that smart, it's all cloud-based. The normalized data model is in the cloud, and all the smartphones point to that for every single app. This is a similar approach that we take at Saphyre. All right, let's go on to the next question. How accurate is the extraction of key terms, data, even when the formatting is inconsistent?
Yeah, so I think that's important. We tackle that in different phases, right? So the first phase that we tackle this in is the initial extraction phase, utilizing some techniques for the actual taking of the image and converting it to text, storing that text, and then normalizing it. So that's the first phase. The next phase is how we apply the combination of the data model and that extracted text to the AI. And the combination of those two things ensures a high level of accuracy. And then as we discussed also, you have the maker-checker process with the human in the loop. Should there be a problem, you're giving it a check, whether it's 2i, 4i, and like you said, 20i, which would be
and
a
this
lot
makes
of
us
checks.
just make sure with the maker-checker step that we're compliant.
Correct.
The fact that we forget the data, we make the AI forget the data, is also compliant. The other thing around the accuracy is it's not a one-time setup and walk away. We have a process to continuously monitor and clean the approach. So I will use an example without mentioning names, but there's this situation where you have party A, party B, and typically, I think, if I remember this correctly, multiple banks will name themselves party B, right? Or party A. And then there's an exception.
Typically, the buy side's party A and sell side's party B.
So exactly. But then there's another situation where they're reversed. And so this is where the normalization of the data model by firm and the interaction between firms, how it's structured, is very important. And then you leverage the AI to remember that, because then you can actually scale it. So this is how you ensure accuracy. But then on occasion, especially when maker-checker steps are missed, we use that as flags to be able to check what happened with the data. Okay, and that's a way you can create a policing mechanism. All right, we got 2 more questions, I think, and then I know we got more, wow. Okay, how do you ensure the security and confidentiality of the legal data you're processing as part of your solution? Excellent question, which you kind of answered, but go ahead.
So a couple of ways, right? Obviously, we are compliant with the overall storage and utilization of the data for the platform, SOC 2, Type 2. We go through compliance audits with every firm we work with. But in addition to that, as we said, the AI instances that we use are dedicated. Those AI instances that we utilize are one-time use, meaning the data is sent, it's interpreted, comes back, it's forgotten. So there's no storing. And then lastly, we have the human validation, the human in the loop.
Yeah, and again, the important thing is if you're leveraging AI, you don't want the AI to still hold on to that information and to do analysis on top of it that is non-compliant. So again, that's a very important step. I know that's a very nuanced thing that some of the techie people will realize, but some of the business people may not know. Okay, cool. Next question, does your approach only work for one make brand of AI? So I guess they're asking specific questions around ChatGPT and Google, et cetera. And I think we hit on this. We take an agnostic approach to the different AI models. So the advice we give is you should be doing the same, because one day you'll find out that one of these are not compliant, or maybe there's an issue, God forbid, and you want to be able to pivot so that your entire business model, your operations isn't dependent on just one solution. So that requires some investment in the infrastructure and foundation, like we talked about earlier.
It's really a design challenge, and designing for multiple solutions so that you can take advantage of whatever model you need to. As the field changes and grows, the model that you choose for different purposes may change.
Yeah, and in our own studies in Saphyre, we found things more effective for images in one ways versus text and legal contracts versus other book texts. So there are strengths and weaknesses to some of these AI solutions. So how do we ensure the data collected from AI is compliant? And I think we hit on this multiple times. Everyone's asking. So again, having the authentication methods of the individuals is very important that Saphyre employs. At least we do. We recommend that you would do the same. The maker-checker process, don't just rely on the AI to do all the work. How do you create a repeatable process on a per-case basis, which we advise? So for how we go through an SSI process, where the AI gets involved, versus, let's say, NAV terminations off of ISDAs and GMRAs is a different process. You help define that with your clients, and that's how you create a repeatable model, but then employ the authentication methods, the maker-checker process, the having the AI forget the information after you get the answers. These are all ways of ensuring you stay compliant. Another question we got is how much cost savings is this? What are firms spending in terms of addressing all these issues without AI and with AI?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say how to answer that, but I can tell you costs can be quite significant. So we've dealt with firms that hire paralegals, and the way they've decided that they're going to extract these key terms and information from their agreements is they're going to hire paralegals and pay them to go through every agreement and type into a spreadsheet all of these terms, and that's millions and millions of dollars. that can be saved. That doesn't need to be done anymore. Once a document is uploaded, it can go straight through this process. You have someone check it and validate it, and then you're done. You're not paying anyone to sit there and read agreement, no high-skilled labor. It can be done by your operations team today.
Yeah, so I think the approach that we've taken is, on a go-forward basis, we just kind of went through that in our presentation. For the incremental stuff, it's a repeatable process. But how do you get started with the baseline, the foundational stuff? What we've done in the past is do a one-time uplift, okay, and get all that information, digitize it into the platform. That's a separate process. We do not combine with the go-forward maintenance process. And I think what's very important to take away is, at least in Saphyre's case, we ensure we create this data normalization as part of the onboarding and maintenance. Before we do that process, that's where we get the bang for your buck. Just think about this. The paralegal process costs, but what's not included in your answer is the post-trade processing costs. The trades that you wind up having to amend, unwind the post-trade processing pieces, the fines that you face for not being compliant on certain details, never mind the SSI details and whatnot, so we can get into that. You're talking double-digit millions, right? Easily for sell sides, in the millions for definitely the buy sides, and it's not just in terms of fines, it's operational costs. Great question. I think this is our last one, and then we'll wrap up. And again, if folks still have other questions, I should just say, you can also email your questions to events@saphyre.com. That's events@saphyre.com, and we will circle back with you with any additional questions that you asked that we did not answer. The last one we got here is, can the AI functionality decide which legal agreement should be chosen based on the details of the new fund launch details? Say you have many agreements with, say, one sell-side counterparty. So this is where a buy-side firm has multiple umbrella agreements, let's say 2 or 3 with a particular sell-side. They're saying, okay, when it comes time to pick the different umbrella agreements, can we automate that process so they don't have to read through the details? And no, I have a quick answer, but
I'll be transparent. We're not doing this today. And Haley, thanks for the question. That's a great idea. Certainly, all of that data is within Saphyre today. We know the counterparties. We know the types of agreements for the types of trading instruments being used. So, great idea.
The framework that we would apply is sometimes some firms name their trading agreements a certain way, and that creates a trigger for picking which umbrella agreement gets applied to each new fund launch and each amendment. So that's one way of applying the rules. You can also say specific terms. The legal terms inside the legal agreement will apply to mutual funds versus collective trust funds, to separately managed accounts or otherwise. So if we know those details, we can apply those rules automatically up front, and it will choose the correct umbrella agreement for you. The thing is, today,
I've got some homework.
Yeah, until today, we never got asked about the use case. But this is when you create a normalized data model. These are the types of things that you can actually pivot on as part of this. But by the way, we would love more questions like this because it creates more repeatable use cases for us to apply the same solution.
Makes the product better for everyone.
Correct. All right, that was great. I was surprised by the number of questions that we got. And I think, this has already been like 47 minutes.
Way over
we
time.
talked 30 minutes. But Brandi and I can talk about this forever because we geek out. So if folks want to hear more, please reach out to us either at info@saphyre.com, or you can email your questions to events@saphyre.com. Now, as a reminder, one last time before we sign off, our next webinar is March 5th. Mark your calendars at 12 p.m. Eastern. It's about how buy-sides can streamline their operations. So thanks so much for your time, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, everyone.